This visit to an archaeological excavation takes us to an ancient village of the Hohokam Indians in southern Arizona, a place called Snaketown on the north bank of the Gila River, 25 miles southeast of Phoenix. The Hohokam were desert dwellers. To live in this harsh environment, they had to develop ways of eking out an existence from the parched but fertile desert soil. Once having learned how to bring land and water together, they achieved a way of life which was good and which permitted them to exist here for nearly 1,500 years. The only evidences of Snaketown today are artificial mounds that rise above the desert floor and a feature known as a ball court. Close examination of the ground reveals a pavement of broken pottery, a sure sign that someone lived there. Snaketown is in the Pima Indian Reservation. It was natural that we should employ Indians of this tribe to do the manual labor for us. Much of this work requires patience and care and is done with the smaller tools that characterize the archaeologist's activities: shovels, picks, trowels, whisk brooms, and the like. The Pimas proved to be effective and sensitive excavators. But we also needed to put to use a larger machine. Snaketown sprawls over about 300 acres, much too extensive to explore with pick and shovel only. This machine, known as a backhoe front-end loader combination, could quickly scoop holes into the desert soil and tell us where the principal evidences of occupation were. Exploratory trenches, dug in a few minutes, were always inspected carefully by someone who knows ground conditions. By studying the sidewalls of the trenches, it could be quickly determined whether more work would be profitable or not. House floors or refuse-filled pits cut into by the machine's bucket were easily recognized. The machine was also used to sample the content of trash mounds. Snaketown's mounds are the product of the tidy living habits of the Hohokam. They brought their unwanted refuse to selected spots and made large piles of it. The material in the mounds is soft and therefore easily excavated. This softness also made the mounds attractive to rodents for nesting places. As the rodent population increased, so also did the snake population, and it was for this reason that the Pima Indians called the village Skullquick or Snaketown. From tests like this, we recovered samples of broken pottery, which gave us an idea of the time when the mounds were formed. The other end of the machine is used to loosen the soil not selected for testing and breaks it away from the mound. To speed up the recovery of objects when hand labor took over the work of the machine, we put into operation several mechanical screens. The Hohokam left no history books, but they did leave a record of their presence. This record can be deciphered, page by page, as a book is read, by carefully removing refuse layer by layer. In this way, materials of different ages are separated, an essential step in the reconstruction of prehistory. This deep hole was once a well. After it had outlived its usefulness, it was filled with refuse. From pits like this, we were able to recover some of our finest or purest samples of pottery, showing the kinds of earthenware that were in style at the time the deposit was made. But the screening process did more than recover broken pieces of pottery, because it also yielded stone and shell artifacts, animal bones, and in this case, a human figurine made of clay. These little figurines were produced by the Hohokam throughout their history. No one knows for certain why they were made, but they probably were the visible symbols of a cult. Hand labor was used in broad-scale stripping. In this way, we were able to locate not only houses, but also areas where specialists did their work, as in this case where shell refuse indicated that a shell craftsman lived nearby. What he broke, or the scraps resulting from his work, he tossed away. Extensive stripping also exposed the clay house floors. All that is left of Hohokam homes. The stratigraphic relationship of these floors revealed the nature of their architectural development. Here we are stepping down from a house dating about AD 1000 to one that's several hundred years older. The overlapping of houses, one on top of another, is a clear indication of the relative age. These structures were rather simple. The floors were sunken below the surface of the ground and covered with brush superstructure, as seen here in an artist's reconstruction. Amongst some of the houses, we found a place where pottery was made. Raw clay was prepared in oval fire-hardened basins in the ground. Vessels were formed by hand without the use of a wheel. Instead, a rounded rock was held inside as an anvil, and a wooden paddle was used to hammer the vessel wall thin on the outside. The same method is still used by the Pimas. When finished and dried, the pottery was fired in large pits using mesquite wood for fuel. The jars shown places the time of the activity about AD 1000. Careful excavation occasionally produces objects like this, a large, unbroken clay vessel. We assumed that it was a cremation jar, but it turned out to have nothing in it. Pottery from Snaketown is heavily coated with lime because of its long burial in the ground. Sometimes the crust can be washed off with water to expose the patterns below, but more often, treatment with dilute hydrochloric acid is required to clean the surfaces. Our workman carefully lifts this pot from its resting place and inspects it. The angular shoulder and the design tell us that it was made about 1,000 years ago. Since Snaketown is flat and there are no nearby natural elevations, we needed to get up high in a helicopter to look down on the work we had done. The mosaic of house floors, about 50 of them, shows more than 1,000 years of architectural history. The detection of house floors requires skill. Subtle differences in ground color and hardness are the clues we follow, and the sound of the trowel is helpful too, ringing when drawn across a hard-packed house floor, a noteless rasp when working in softer soil. The holes in which posts were set to form either the roof supports of the house or the side braces were located and uncovered. The arrangement of these is the basis for determining the kind of roof that once covered the structure. Broken pottery is everywhere. Sometimes it rests on house floors, or it is in the trash that fills the houses. Each house had its own fireplace, a carefully fashioned clay basin. We think that fires were built outside of the houses, from which live coals were taken inside for warming and cooking purposes. This would have reduced the smoke nuisance and the hazard of fire in the roof structure. The baked clay in the fire pits retains information about the drift of the magnetic pole, which is helpful in dating. Coming into view now is one of the oldest houses in the village, dating from about 300 BC. But on the floor of this dwelling there was a deposit of pottery vessels, an enamel coffee pot, a sawed beef bone, an iron cooking stand, and other items which clearly indicated to us that these were put there by the Pima Indians. Thus, by a strange prank of history, the Pimas, within the past 100 years, buried the possessions of one of their deceased on a house floor more than 2,000 years old. This house is interesting because of its great age and size, its 2 entrances and 2 fireplaces. Since all of the oldest houses were large, like this one, we believe they may have sheltered more than one family, in contrast to the smaller, later houses, which apparently were single-family units. A fire built on one of the hearths emphasizes its nearness to the entrance. This indicates that there was no smoke hole in the roof and that the smoke drifted out the doorway. Close examination of the floor revealed the impression of a woven mat on which the house occupants may have slept. Pressed into the clay below the mat were numerous shell beads. Evidently the Indians slept with their jewelry on. Now and again, strings of beads would break, and some of the individual beads would disappear through the holes in the matting. Winter rains, although infrequent, not only slowed down the work, but were damaging to exposed features. To protect the excavations and prevent the holes from becoming pools of water, we used large plastic sheets to turn the rain aside. Here, we see the front-end loader removing dirt from the immediate premises of the excavation. Careful digging with the trowel sometimes turns up surprises. The head of a bird effigy vessel has been discovered, the open mouth representing the spout of the container. Stripping the surface debris widely down to the desert soil paid off in a number of ways. We not only found many houses, but caches of cultural treasures as well. These are fragments of thick-walled pottery vessels, which we call censers, because we think they were used for burning incense. The tragedy of caches of this kind is that the objects are always broken, willfully smashed, sometimes burned, and then buried. A modeled human face decorates the side of this incense burner, an art form that reminds us of the objects in Mexico. In fact, Mexican origins are recognized for many things the Hohokam made. In one place, our excavations revealed a concentration of many artifacts. Peeking out are a number of fragments of clay animal figurines. The first step in understanding what we had was to outline the area occupied by the specimens. Smashed pottery was found high in what appeared to be a circular pit. 90 specimens were recovered. All but one were broken or burned. Intentional destruction indicates that these were sacrifices, another idea probably spread from Mexico. As we kept digging deeper, interesting items continued to appear. A piece of basketry preserved by charring, here being treated with cellulose in a solvent to prevent further deterioration. The scattered parts of a human figurine are located and fitted together. An interesting looking piece that proved to have a face on it was part of an effigy pot. Later on, it will be matched to other fragments that belong to it. This small vessel, in the shape of a bird, with wings and a stubby tail, modeled in clay, escaped the destruction suffered by the other objects. Most interesting of all in this cache were figurines of animals, fragments of which kept appearing by the score. There were 19 in all when pieced together. We can only speculate what animal they represented, most likely the deer. We suspect that they were used in connection with magical fertility rites. Returned to the field from the laboratory after restoration, they made possible this interesting scene. In another cache, we found many fragments of carved stone vessels. The Hohokam were superior craftsmen in shaping small stone objects, a sharp contrast with the monumental statues produced by the artists of Mexico. These bits of delicately carved stone were carefully taken from the ground, and the adjacent soil was screened to recover pieces carried away by rodents whose tunnels disturbed the deposit. After cleaning and piecing together, we could appreciate the beauty and the subject matter of the final products, as we will see later. Since the Hohokam had no metal tools, we know that sculpturing was achieved by working stone with stone. Few would attempt to duplicate this feat today. In museums, one sees handsome vessels on exhibit, but it should be remembered that they seldom come out of the ground unbroken. Skillful restoration is usually required. Here is an example. This large cauldron-like vessel was broken by ground pressure. The excavator removes the pieces carefully, avoiding further breakage and making sure that he recovers all of the fragments. They are then sent to the laboratory for cleaning. Since Snaketown pottery is encrusted heavily with lime, it must be specially treated. It is first soaked in water and then bathed in hydrochloric acid to remove the lime crust. Hohokam pottery doesn't stand any scrubbing because the paint can easily be washed off. After the acid treatment, the pieces are rinsed again in water and allowed to dry. The next step is mending, pasting the pieces together, a real challenge for those who like jigsaw puzzles. Our two laboratory assistants plus two Pima Indian ladies washed at least 1.5 million fragments of pottery, most of which were studied to understand how pottery developed. After analyzing and selecting those fragments we wanted to keep, the rest were discarded on this pile, which grew to huge proportions. Potsherds are useful to the archaeologist because they reveal form and design changes which provide the basis for a pottery calendar, or a way of measuring the passage of time. We used approximately 30 Pima workers who now live on the Gila River Indian Reservation. They were most cooperative, understanding of our needs, and deeply interested in what they were doing. Payday was eagerly awaited. Here we see Job Hayes, the father of Ira Hayes, who was associated with the Iwo Jima flag-raising incident during World War II. Once again, we take to the helicopter to look down on the largest individual feature at Snaketown, the ball court. As seen today, the ball court is a large oval basin, almost as long as a football field. The sides are earthen embankments that once stood about 12 feet high. They were faced with clay plaster, and the floor was hard-packed clay, as we learned when half of the court was excavated in 1934. It must have been the center of much activity, social and perhaps religious, in this old Hohokam village. These men are running through it to demonstrate how spacious it is. It is called a ball court because it resembles in many features the ball courts of ancient Mexico and Central America. Accounts written by Spanish chroniclers who observed the game provide details of how it was played. From this information, we speculate that there were hoops in the sides of the Snaketown court and that a rubber ball was used in playing the game. Two teams of players competed with each other, trying to be the first to bounce the ball off a player's body through the hoop. A shinny-like game is played today by Pima and Maricopa girls, a survival from early days, but not necessarily from the game played in the ball court. During the 7 months of excavation in Snaketown, we were able to sample many parts of the site. Among the most interesting features were the refuse mounds. Strangely enough, what man throws away tells us not only how he made his living, but how he lived. As trash accumulated day after day, it grew into a large and doubtless smelly heaps, with clearly marked layers of ashes and broken pottery. This is looking down into one of the mounds where many events took place before it grew. An old house floor was engulfed by refuse. Incense burners and numerous human figurines were buried, possibly as votive offerings. Black paint has been used on this figurine to represent hair. Because of an accident of preservation, we learned how the Indians dug holes in the ground. They used sharpened sticks, scars of which are preserved in the sides of a heavily burned pit. Wells, clay for house floors and pottery, and irrigation canals must have been excavated with this simple tool. Another feature under the mound was a large roasting pit which employed heated rocks, or the principle of the fireless cooker for preparing foods. We are now going to examine closely a large trash mound in which several stratigraphic tests were made, Mound 39. It may be assumed that in a large mound, the oldest trash is at the bottom, the youngest at the top. Stripped away carefully, layer by layer, the refuse yields samples of broken pottery and other artifacts which the archaeologist can compare. In this way, changing styles, for example in the painting of pottery, are detected between early and late samples. To make room for the carefully controlled test, surplus dirt is hauled away. A worker always looks through the rubbish to make sure nothing of importance is missed. 2 tests were made simultaneously, one on the west side and the other on the east side of the mound, both employing mechanical screens. Screening was necessary to recover all of the remnants of daily living that time has not destroyed. The third and last test was placed in the center of the mound. More than 44 cubic yards of refuse were removed, and 100,000 fragments of pottery were recovered in these 3 tests. This was the way the trench appeared at the completion of the operation. Good stratigraphic information came out of the effort, and we learned something else that was not expected. The mound was surfaced in its last stage by a hard, clean layer of caliche and clay. 2 other cappings on an older mound that originally extended to the west were also detected. The series of events which make up this story were as follows. A relatively small trash mound was first surfaced. Its size was next increased by adding more refuse, which in turn was capped with a compact layer of caliche clay. Then most of this mound was removed physically, and a new one, a much larger one, was formed to the east. It too was surfaced. Our cut through this last mound revealed the traces of the older one, giving us the unusual record of the 3 steps that make up the story of the mound. The evidence clearly indicated to us that the Hohokam had mounds which they used as stages, probably for dances, beginning as early as AD 500. The flat-top pyramids and platforms of Mexico were the inspiration for these. The clearest example of a specially constructed mound at Snaketown was this one, Mound 16, datable to the 11th century. It was made by piling up natural dirt to a height of 3 feet and a round, flat-topped elevation, 50 feet in diameter. The sloping sides were faced with a mixture of caliche and clay, a more durable material than made up the core of the mound. We recognized 8 different layers or surfaces which represented enlargements or repairs to the structure. The excavation of fragile remains of this kind requires the greatest patience, care, and skill. At all steps in archaeological work, mapping and photography are vital aids in the recording process. These are essential to accurate reporting and interpretation, and will be helpful also when parts of Snaketown are developed as exhibits. In most of the Southwest, earth burial was the usual means of disposing of the dead. In contrast, the Hohokam cremated. Because of this custom, little is known about their physical characteristics. At the edge and partly under Mound 38, we located a large dirt floor on which the dead were burned in shallow pits. Made of hard-packed earth and reddened by many fires, the floor had near its center 5 oval depressions where the actual cremations took place. The evidence suggests that mesquite wood was stacked over a shallow basin, and on top of it the body was placed. As the fuel and the body were consumed, the ashes tumbled into the basin from which they could be recovered for burial elsewhere. The last person to be cremated, however, was not accorded this treatment because we are here recovering the bones of that individual. Under normal conditions, the bones were buried away from the spot of the actual burning. Depending upon the period of time in the tribe's history, the bones were either put into pottery jars or buried in small pits in the ground. Disposal of the ashes was usually in selected areas, not unlike our cemeteries. When found, the deposits of human ashes are always carefully screened because bits of shell jewelry, beads, and other artifacts, probably the possessions of the deceased, may be recovered. Screens of different sized mesh ensure the finding of the smallest articles. When completely exposed, the crematory floor looked like this. It was not difficult to imagine the death rites that took place on it. In order to recover the full story of archaeological features, it often becomes necessary to destroy the late parts to find out what was below. As we stripped away the crematory floor, hearths in rows, from 2 to 5 in number, came into view. These hearths are distinguished from others in the village by their perpendicular walls, uniformity of diameter, and sides smeared with a thin layer of clay. While we cannot be sure of their use, it is likely that they fulfilled ritual purposes in the preparation of food or drink. In the central part of Snaketown, the ground conditions were such that water could be reached by digging a well not more than 10 feet in depth. It was in this area that we found thick deposits of early trash, refuse thrown into excavations that once were wells. While we learned a good bit from this, we could not, because of the extensive prehistoric disturbances, reconstruct the character of any one of these wells. We think they were of a walk-in type. This means that a conical-shaped hole was dug which reached the water table, and a person could walk down into the well to fill a jar with water. Successful agriculture in the state of Arizona today is dependent upon irrigation. Here, a Pima Indian is working in his cotton field. The Hohokam, more than 2,000 years ago, were attracted to the arid desert by its flowing river, the Gila, by the adjacent flatlands, and by the ease with which water could be taken out of the river and guided through canals to thirsty fields. Modern practices reflect the old. Here we have a temporary dam designed to hold back the water for siphoning into the channels between rows of cotton plants. The siphon tubes the Hohokam did not know. In another instance, the dike that withheld the water was opened, allowing a bordered field to flood. It is now being closed again, sending the water to the next field. Employing a water technology skillfully, the Hohokam brought water to fields near Snaketown from a point on the river at least 3 miles distant. The youngest, or 14th century canal, is traceable today on the desert surface as a trough riding between ridges of silt that accumulated from the endless task of ditch maintenance. We wanted to know about older canals. To explore for these, we dug long trenches at right angles through the youngest canal, hoping to pick up earlier traces below. A careful reading of the trench walls revealed differences in the color, hardness, and structure of the soils. By noting these, we soon detected the places where the older canals were. Having determined what they looked like in cross-section, we could then plan our strategy for excavating broadly to expose portions of the canals to full view. Superpositions of canals represent remodelings of the irrigation systems, or cleanings at different times. Each cleaning did not go to the full depth of the original or older canal, so we have one canal riding on top of another. 2 are seen here. The top one, therefore the most recent, was last used in the 14th century. At the east edge of Snaketown, we uncovered a canal turnout, or where a single canal split into 2. From the main artery, a side ditch led water away to fields on a lower level. Erosion plagued the Indians just as it troubles our ranchers today. Too much water, or water that flowed too swiftly, gouged out the canal bottom. The resulting hole was filled with broken pottery and worn-out grinding stones to check the erosive process. Two matates at the bottom of this emergency repair are being removed and examined. We know from the nature of the broken pottery that this event took place sometime after AD 1000. When canals divided, some kind of a structure was needed to divert water from one to the other. The post holes in the canal on the left indicate where one of these gates stood. The artist's reconstruction, based on our findings, shows a framework of stout sticks against which a mat was laid, making a temporary dam as a means of controlling the water, forecasting the methods of modern irrigators. One of our principal goals in going to Snaketown was to see how far back in time we could trace irrigated agriculture as the way of life among the Hohokam. We had convincing evidence of irrigation as early as AD 700. It was believed that traces of older canals must exist. The desired evidence was found shortly before we were to close the operation. This required putting the whole labor force into exposing a 230-foot stretch of the oldest canal. Remodeling of the later canal systems partly destroyed the earlier waterway. This was a fortunate circumstance because we could determine by the overlaps which canals were early, which were of intermediate age, and which ones were late. The two men approaching are in the original and oldest canal at Snaketown. It was constructed about 300 BC. The man on the left traces a canal excavated many hundreds of years later. And finally, the 14th century canal is being followed by the man walking in it. Artifacts in the canals, mostly broken pottery, were also helpful in establishing the time of their use. A cross-section of the late canal shows that its bed shifted progressively from left to right in the process of remodeling. Here, we are looking down a canal while a workman traces its pattern where it disappears into the untouched desert. Depressions in the bottom of the oldest canal were collecting pools to concentrate the water when it was not flowing. At the edge of one of these, there was a footstep, a place for the knee, and a vertical groove which was produced by dragging a dipper against the ground during the act of scooping water from the pool. The building of irrigation systems was the outstanding achievement of the Hohokam, a technological skill unmatched anywhere north of Mexico at this early time. The pottery made by the Hohokam was painted in red on a buff background. Because pottery was produced for hundreds and hundreds of years, it underwent changes in shape and in the patterns painted upon it. These changes assist us in detecting which kinds of pottery were early and which were late, once having found them in a stratigraphic relationship. One of the vessel shapes that was popular for a long time was the plate. The one now being held up was made about AD 900. Vessels of enormous size characterized the late period. Jars stored surplus crops, but what special purpose cauldron-like vessels may have had, we do not know. This is the one seen earlier as it was being removed from the ground. Hohokam potters were skilled modelers of human effigy vessels, a shape probably borrowed from Mexico. Some incense burners were fashioned in the image of animals, mountain sheep in this case, and a few have hollow gravel-filled bottoms and did double duty as rattles. Among the small clay artifacts produced by the Hohokam, the most interesting are the modeled human figurines. They range from 1 to several inches in length. Like pottery, these changed through time. In the oldest ones, the faces were conventional. Headbands were known, and some figurines have curious cheek plugs, perhaps an ancient way of decorating the face. Gradually, more details were added, and the faces became more realistic, some of them taking on the qualities of portraits. Figurines are further evidence of Hohokam contact with the highly developed civilizations of Mexico. Seashells were particularly attractive to the Hohokam because they could be easily shaped into many kinds of jewelry. By grinding and carving using stone tools, shells were made into attractive bracelets, here representing a bird and a snake. Minute and beautifully carved frogs were a favorite subject. Rings were of different kinds. And flat pieces of pearly shell were made into a great variety of pendants. The pink shell in this handsome bead necklace was provided by the spiny oyster. It could be worn with pride today. A unique method developed by the Hohokam for decorating shell was etching, employing the use of a wax or resistant material and an acid. We think that fermented saguaro fruit juice, a weak acetic acid, was used to etch this handsome horned toad into the outer surface of a clam-like shell. Evidence that pitch-protected surfaces against the bite of the acid is seen here. A thick, once sticky substance put on the shell in the image of a horned toad, but the craftsman never got around to etching it. The Hohokam were outstanding sculptors of stone on a small scale. Fine-grained rocks were preferred, all imported because there was no local source of supply. This little statue, about 6 inches high, holding a vessel in the lap, reminds us of the chalk mold sculptures of Mexico. Hohokam artisans made many small stone cups, possibly to hold medicine, magical concoctions, or for burning incense. Some were beautifully carved in high relief, a rattlesnake in the act of catching a frog. Others were executed in the full round, as this handle, in the form of a snake coiled back on itself, enveloping a tapered and pointed object. The animals depicted the Hohokam knew well, for they shared the desert environment. The repeated use of life forms in art is a hint that the Hohokam believed these creatures to have magical powers, and possibly even to be the causes of illnesses. The early Pima Indians firmly believed that the rattlesnake caused kidney and stomach troubles in children, the horned toad, rheumatism. Cures were singing the rattlesnake or the horned toad song, and pressing an image of the creature on the patient. It is tempting to believe that these objects served the ancient ones in a similar manner. Occasionally, the human form was also the subject for sculptures, usually 2 figures facing each other, clutching a receptacle between them. Most of the carvings we have seen were recovered from one sacrificial cache in which all of the pieces were shattered. They date from about AD 700 to 900. Semi-precious gemstones, turquoise as an example, were handsomely shaped for personal jewelry, and these thin sheets of rock were fashioned into a flight of birds. One of the favorite stone articles made by the Hohokam was the Slate Palate. It was designed for mixing pigments, perhaps for body painting. The frequent recovery of palettes with the bones of the cremated dead suggests that they were used in death rituals. Sometimes Hohokam art reveals their activities. Dancing human figures are here shown in relief on stone, and the same idea occurs again and again as painted decorations on pottery. The circle dance that apparently inspired this art form survives today among the Pima Indians. These Indians believe themselves to be the descendants of the Hohokam, a view which is supported by many of the archaeological findings. The Pimas were well established where they now are when first seen by Europeans in the 16th century. Their way of life, including dependence upon irrigated agriculture, reflects a long residence in the desert and an intimate familiarity with its landmarks. For example, specific mountains are deeply woven into Pima mythology. The basket dance performed by Pima ladies is a revival of an old festive dance. It is a good example of the slow and measured steps that characterize the Pima dance style. This gay occasion at Snaketown was sponsored by the Gila River Indian Tribal Council. Attended by about 500 people, most of them Indians, they came to share in the delicious barbecue, but more importantly, to help celebrate the selection of Snaketown as a place of exceptional importance in shedding light on the prehistory of the Southwest and of our nation. The high sides of the ball court made natural bleachers for the audience, just as they must have served the watchers of the ball game of old. Mr. Lloyd Allison, the governor of the Gila River Indian tribe, is about to accept a bronze plaque designating Snaketown as a registered National Historic Landmark. This ancient village was selected for recognition by the Secretary of Interior, Stuart Udall, upon the recommendation of the Advisory Board on National Parks, Historic Sites, Buildings, and Monuments. The Advisory Board on National Parks has further recommended to Secretary Udall that Snaketown be made a national monument. When the needed legislation has been enacted to accomplish this, the features here being covered to protect them can again be reopened and converted into exhibits for all to see. When that happens, Snaketown will indeed be a monument to Hohokam's skill, ingenuity, and perseverance in their successful conquest of the desert.